Chasing her might feel like the right thing to do in the moment, especially when emotions are high and your mind is convinced that effort equals results. But the truth is far more brutal and far more stoic. The more you chase her, the more you inflate her ego, the more you shrink your own value, and the more predictable you become. In chasing, you signal that you are willing to abandon your center just to gain her attention. You show her that your emotional state is dependent on her responses. And whether she admits it or not, that gives her a sense of power, one she begins to take for granted, one she stops respecting, and one she eventually grows bored of. A woman does not admire the man she can emotionally control. She admires the man who controls himself. But ignoring her changes everything. Ignoring her is not about being cold, cruel, or manipulative. It is about shifting the focus back to yourself and reclaiming the emotional energy you have been pouring into her. It is about growing instead of begging. When you ignore, you are not running from connection. You are stepping back to regain clarity. You are choosing yourself over impulsive emotional reactions. And quietly, without fanfare, that self-respect becomes visible. She sees it even when you say nothing. Your silence begins to speak louder than your words ever did. It shows growth, maturity, and a refusal to be emotionally dependent. It shows that you are not a man who clings. You are a man who evolves. When you stop chasing, she suddenly feels something she was not expecting, a shift. She begins to notice the absence of your effort, your attention, your presence. And because human psychology is wired the way it is, what was once taken for granted becomes something she starts to crave again. The moment you withdraw your energy, she begins to reflect. She goes from feeling certain of your availability to questioning where she stands with you. That internal confusion cracks her ego. It forces introspection. She begins to wonder what changed, why you changed, and whether she misjudged your worth. Chasing feeds her ego, but ignoring feeds her curiosity. Curiosity grows into reflection, and reflection often turns into regret. She starts replaying moments, analyzing conversations, remembering the things you did that she barely acknowledged before. She may not admit it, but she feels the loss of your attention, because attention carries value, especially when it comes from a man she once felt secure in having. When that security disappears, she starts questioning her own choices, her own behavior, and the assumptions she built about you. In that space of silence, something else happens, something more important than her reaction. You grow. Ignoring her puts you back in alignment with yourself. You begin to focus on your goals, your stability, your discipline. You improve yourself physically, mentally, and emotionally. You redirect the energy you once wasted into areas that strengthen your character, and that growth makes you even more attractive, even more grounded, and even harder to replace. Ignoring is not about playing a game. It is about breaking a pattern. It is choosing your self-respect over emotional desperation. It is choosing your dignity over validation. It is choosing your future over temporary panic. When you ignore her, you are not hurting her. You are healing yourself. You are reminding yourself that your worth is not decided by someone else's response. And in that quiet space, you become a man she begins to see differently. Not because you forced her to, but because you restored your value from within. Ending line: sometimes the strongest message you'll ever send is the one spoken in silence. Silence has a strange way of revealing truths we never noticed before. When you stop chasing her and create distance, you aren't just stepping away physically, you're stepping away mentally, emotionally, and energetically. And in that space, something powerful begins to happen. She starts to feel your absence in a way she never felt your presence. The human mind fixates on what's missing, not on what's available. When you were constantly present, texting, calling, checking in, trying to fix problems, she had no reason to think about you deeply. You were a constant, a guarantee, a safety net she assumed would always remain where she left it. But the moment you stop showing up, that constant becomes a question, and that question becomes a weight she can't shake off. Your absence becomes louder than your voice ever was. It echoes in the quiet moments of her day, in the spaces where your messages used to appear, in the times she expected your attention, and in the moments she assumed you'd chase after her. She may not admit it, but she feels a small jolt of confusion every time her phone stays silent. She feels a subtle sting when she realizes you didn't check her story, didn't ask how she is, didn't try to understand what she's feeling. That quiet realization builds slowly, layer by layer, until she can no longer ignore it. Silence forces her into reflection. Women think deeply when the noise stops, when the external validation disappears, when the attention they relied on suddenly evaporates. She starts to analyze everything, your behavior, her actions toward you, the way she responded during arguments, how she may have taken your efforts for granted. She replays moments she brushed off, times she rolled her eyes at your affection, times she dismissed your consistency as neediness. Your absence magnifies those memories, making her realize that what she once treated casually had far more value than she recognized. This is why ignoring her is so effective. It gives her mind the room to process what she never took seriously. As long as you chased her, she had no need to evaluate you because she already believed she knew everything about you. Your predictability gave her comfort, and that comfort turned into complacency. But when you remove that predictability, she begins to see you through a different lens. Suddenly, you're not the man who can be summoned with a single message. You're not the man she can push away with no consequence. You're not the man who will tolerate disrespect, neglect, or emotional games. Your absence becomes a mirror in which she sees the truth of who you are and who she failed to appreciate. She starts to notice what other men lack compared to you. She starts recognizing the small things you did that made her feel secure, supported, or understood. And the more she compares, the heavier your absence becomes. It turns into a presence in her mind, replaying, questioning, reminding her of what she lost and why it feels irreplaceable. But more importantly, your absence gives you the clarity you need. While she wrestles with her thoughts, you are free to realign yourself with your standards, your peace, and your path. You begin to see your own worth without needing her reaction to validate it. You start to understand that love without respect is not love, and effort without appreciation is not effort, it's self-betrayal. Ignoring her works because it detaches you from illusion and brings both of you face to face with reality. She realizes what she lost. You realize what you deserve, and in that divide, the power shifts back to where it always belonged, within you. Ending line in the silence you create, she finally hears everything she refused to listen to before. When you finally stop chasing her, something happens that she never prepared herself for. She is forced to reevaluate everything she thought she knew about her. The shift is sudden, unexpected, and unsettling for her. She had built a mental image of you, an image shaped by how available you were, how quickly you responded, how eager you seemed to keep the connection alive. She thought she understood your patterns. She believed she knew your emotional priorities. But when you pull back, that old version of you no longer exists, and this forces her mind into a state of reassessment she cannot ignore. Human psychology is simple in one way. We evaluate things based on contrast. When something is always present, it blends into the background. It's familiar, predictable, and easy to overlook. But remove that presence, and suddenly the mind sees it differently. She begins to question her assumptions because now the reality in front of her contradicts the story she was telling herself. She told herself you'd always try. She told herself you'd keep chasing. She believed she had you figured out, but your unexpected silence disrupts that narrative, and that disruption is powerful. When she sees you no longer reacting, no longer seeking validation, no longer circling around her, she starts to wonder if she misjudged your worth. Maybe you were not the easy-to-get man she thought you were. Maybe you were not the emotional option she believed would always be available. Her mind begins to revisit the way you carried yourself, the things you said, the consistency you showed. All the things she dismissed suddenly feel heavier because now they're missing, and their absence forces her to notice their value. She begins comparing you not to the fantasy she created, but to the reality of the men around her. Men who lack your emotional stability. Men who cannot communicate the way you did. Men who don't offer the security, presence, and depth she once had access to without realizing its rarity. The more she experiences this contrast, the more her mind returns to you, not because you chased her, but because you stopped. This shift also forces her to reevaluate her own behavior. Instead of focusing on your neediness, she starts questioning her own dismissiveness. Instead of judging your effort, she starts wondering why she didn't match it. Instead of assuming she was the one in control, she starts realizing the dynamic was only balanced because you allowed it to be. Your withdrawal exposes her pride, her assumptions, and her mistakes. She sees, maybe for the first time, how she contributed to the distance that now exists between you. This is when regret begins to grow, not because you punished her, but because she is finally seeing the situation without the fog of ego. She wonders if she pushed too hard, tested too far, took too much for granted. She questions whether her reactions were driven by emotion rather than clarity. And as these thoughts start to build, her confidence slips into uncertainty. She realizes she may have misread the situation. She realizes she may have misread you. But the most important part of this entire shift is what it reveals about you. When she sees you step back with dignity rather than bitterness, with calm rather than chaos, she begins to recognize your emotional intelligence. That is rare, that is valuable, and that is something she cannot replace easily. Ignoring her forces her mind to revisit her assumptions. And the more she reevaluates, the more your value rises. Not because you changed who you are, but because she is finally seeing what was always there. Ending line, sometimes the moment you stop proving your worth is the moment she finally understands it. When you finally detach and stop reacting to her emotions, something profound happens, not just in the dynamic between you and her, but within her inner world. Detachment removes the noise, it removes the arguments, the misinterpretations, the emotional tug of war, and with nothing left for her to push against, nothing left for her to blame, nothing left to use as fuel for her narrative, she is forced to face her true feelings. No more distractions, no more excuses, no more pointing fingers, just the truth she has avoided for far too long. When you were chasing, she could always rationalize her behavior. She could tell herself you were too emotional, too reactive, too eager. She could shift responsibility because your presence made it easy for her to avoid looking inward. Your reactions gave her a shield, your effort gave her an escape, your availability gave her an excuse. But when you detach, truly detach, not pretend, not play games, those excuses fall apart. Your silence removes the emotional cushion she relied on. Your calm removes the chaos she projected onto you. Your distance removes the ability to twist the narrative into something that paints her as the rational one and you as the unstable one. Detachment creates clarity, and clarity exposes truth. Suddenly, she can no longer say you were too intense. You're quiet now. She can no longer say you were too involved. You're absent. She can no longer say you pressured her. You're distant. She can no longer say you caused the emotional tension. You've removed yourself from the battlefield completely. And that is when her true feelings begin to surface. Not the feelings she displayed when she thought she had control, not the reactions she used to maintain the upper hand, but the real emotional responses she buried beneath ego, pride, and certainty. You see, a woman's loudness often hides her confusion, but her silence reveals her truth, and your detachment forces her into her own silence. Now, without you to blame, her mind begins to replay everything. She thinks about what she said, how she responded, the times she tested you, the times she ignored the effort you gave so freely. She starts to wonder if she acted too quickly, judged too harshly, pulled away too soon. She begins to question herself, because your detachment shows her something she didn't expect: strength, self-control, peace. And nothing is more disorienting to someone who thought they had emotional power over you than watching you move on without a fight. Detachment is powerful because it doesn't demand anything from her. It doesn't force a reaction. It doesn't manipulate the situation. It simply removes your energy from a place it was being wasted. And the moment your energy is gone, she begins to feel the weight of the emptiness that remains. That emptiness becomes her mirror. It reflects back her insecurities, her misjudgments, her fear of losing someone who truly cared. In detachment, she can no longer hide behind pride. Pride cannot protect her from the feeling of losing something real. She might have been strong enough to push you away, but she is not strong enough to ignore the void you leave behind. And that void becomes the space where her real feelings rise to the surface. Feelings she suppressed, denied, or failed to understand when you were still there. Your calm becomes her confusion. Your distance becomes her longing. Your silence becomes her realization. And that realization is often the one she never expected to face. That she cared more than she ever showed, and now your detachment has exposed it all. Ending line in the quiet created by your distance. Her truth finally has nowhere left to hide. When you finally stop chasing her, what you're really doing is redirecting your power back into your own life. And the moment you do that, the entire dynamic shifts, not because you're trying to teach her a lesson, not because you're playing games, but because you're reclaiming the one thing she could feel slipping every time you pursued her, your sense of self. A man who stops chasing and starts choosing himself again becomes a force she can't easily ignore, and that transformation is far more powerful than any words you could ever say. See, when you were chasing, you were pouring energy outward, trying to prove your worth, trying to earn her attention, trying to keep something alive that she herself wasn't investing in. But when you stop, that energy stops flowing toward her and starts flowing back into your ambitions, your routines, your discipline. You lift yourself out of emotional dependence and step back into the world as someone who stands on his own foundation. And the truth is, nothing is more attractive or more intimidating than a man who appears whole without her. The shift is subtle at first, but undeniable. You begin to focus on your growth, your path, your mental clarity. You become more present in your own life, more committed to the things she once felt competing with her attention. You start moving with a calmness that comes from knowing you no longer hinge your happiness on her response. And the moment she senses that change, something in her begins to recalibrate. Suddenly, the man she felt she could predict is unpredictable. The man she felt she could take for granted feels distant. The man she believed would always be there moves in a direction that has nothing to do with her. Remember this, a woman can ignore your messages, your efforts, your chase, but she can't ignore your absence. Your absence makes her feel what your presence couldn't. Your detachment becomes a silent statement. My value doesn't shrink just because you can't see it. And that realization shakes her more deeply than confrontation ever could. Because now, instead of being the man who waits, you become the man she has to wonder about. She starts to notice the difference in your energy. She starts questioning whether she misjudged you, whether she underestimated your strength, whether she made the mistake of confusing devotion with weakness. And while she sits with those thoughts, you're not sitting still, you're growing. Every step you take toward your goals is a step away from the version of yourself who would have done anything for her approval. That version dissolves, and in its place stands a man rooted in Stoic self-governance. And here's where the deeper truth lies. When you invest in yourself, your life naturally becomes fuller, richer, more aligned. You no longer seek validation from her because you find fulfillment in your progress. She may want to return, she may want your attention again, but the key is that your focus is no longer driven by whether she comes back. It's driven by who you are becoming, and that is the transformation she doesn't expect. The version of you who no longer needs her is the version she ends up drawn to. Your growth becomes your gravity. Your discipline becomes your power. Your independence becomes the thing she cannot replace. Because at the end of the day, ignoring her works better than chasing, not because she loses something, but because you finally gain everything you had been neglecting within yourself, Ending line, when you rise into your own strength, she can't help but feel the distance you created for your own peace. When you reach the point where ignoring her is no longer a strategy, but a natural consequence of choosing your own peace, something powerful happens, not just in her mind, but in yours. This final shift isn't about winning her back, proving a point, or manipulating the situation. It's about evolving into a man who no longer operates from emotional reaction, but from grounded self-command. And this is where the deepest transformation occurs. You stop responding to her behavior and start responding to your own values. When you were chasing her, you were reacting. Every text she didn't send, every delayed reply, every mixed signal, these things dictated your emotional state. But when you stop giving those moments the power to control your internal world, you walk into the essence of Stoicism, the mastery of your own perception. You begin to understand that her behavior doesn't define you, it doesn't diminish you, and it doesn't determine the direction of your life. What matters is how you carry yourself, what you invest in, and how firmly you hold your own standards. This shift creates a mental clarity you may not have felt. In months, you start realizing that the version of you who chased wasn't weak. He was simply misaligned. He was operating from a place of desire instead of discipline. He was giving energy to someone who wasn't returning it. But now, you move with intention. You choose distance not out of anger, but out of respect. Respect for yourself, your time, your purpose, and that respect that she feels most intensely. Because when a man evolves past the need for validation, he becomes someone new, someone she didn't expect, someone she can't predict, someone she can't easily influence. She feels the shift in your silence, the strength in your calmness, the confidence in your lack of urgency. She remembers the man who once jumped at every breadcrumb of attention, and now she sees a man who doesn't even look in her direction unless it aligns with his peace. What she never accounts for is your growth. She expects distance to be temporary, a phase, a reaction. But then she realizes it isn't distance, it's transformation. You weren't ignoring her to get something from her. You're ignoring her because you've outgrown the version of yourself who needed her to feel complete. That realization is far more powerful than any speech you could give or any explanation you could offer. Now, your focus is on your craft, your health, your progress, your inner world. And the more you invest in yourself, the more you separate your identity from the outcome. Whether she notices or not, whether she returns or not, becomes irrelevant. Your life no longer revolves around whether you're in her thoughts. It revolves around whether you're proud of the man you're becoming. This is the point where ignoring her becomes effortless, not because you're trying to be cold, but because your world has expanded beyond her. What once consumed you now barely has space in your mind, and that freedom reshapes your energy into something magnetic. People start noticing, opportunities start opening, your discipline sharpens, your confidence grows, your presence becomes heavier, not because you're trying to be impressive, but because you are finally aligned with yourself. In the end, ignoring her works not because she feels your absence, but because you finally feel your own presence. You become a man defined by his growth, not his longing. Ending line, when you stop chasing and start choosing yourself, the world, and she can't help but notice the power of the transformation.